During the painstaking years of escalating violence and series of conflicts between Israel and Hamas, Western nations rallied behind Israel with countries including the US, UK, and Germany offering military support in the fighting in Gaza. Meanwhile, many other countries, especially in Africa, had also called on Israel to stop its aggression and offered solidarity with the people of Gaza. In effect, the nation of South Africa blamed Israel's actions for the violence, citing the illegal occupation of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and other Christian sites. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa vehemently underscored the country's historic support for the just struggle of Palestinians and offered to help mediate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The war between Palestine and Israel spans decades and has left in its wake a trail of corpses. Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor had once stated during a ministerial statement on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, "Those of us who are free from apartheid cannot ever consent to any form of oppression that is apartheid-related. We cannot put up with this." Given that the largest trading partner of Israel on the African continent is South Africa, why then did South Africa voice opposition to Israel in favor of Palestine? And in what ways have relations between Palestine and Africa evolved over time? Hello everyone, if you're new here, welcome. In this video, we'll be looking at why South Africa stands strongly in support of Palestine. The Israeli-South Africa relationship context. Like many other nations, including India, South Africa also suffered greatly from colonialism and has long supported the Palestinian cause. The struggle of the Palestinian people, who were driven from their homes and land in 1948, was supported by African nations that gained independence from the cruel colonial rule in the 1960s. Israel openly criticized South Africa's apartheid government in the 1950s and 60s in an effort to build positive ties with the continent's black majority nations. But in 1973, the majority of African nations cut their ties to Israel because of financial threats from Arab oil-producing nations. During the 1970s and 1980s, Israel strengthened its diplomatic relations with South Africa as a result of this circumstance. Israel was the only democratic nation that, by 1986, had abstained from the majority of the international sanctions that the world community had placed on South Africa's apartheid regime. However, Israel became a part of the sanctions the next year, primarily due to pressure from the United States. The African National Congress, ANC, and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, formed a historic alliance that contributed to South Africa's position, tilting towards the Palestinians. Although relations under Mandela remained cordial after apartheid fell in 1994, they have since sharply deteriorated. Currently, South Africa has an embassy in Tel Aviv, and Israel has an embassy in Pretoria and a trade office in Johannesburg. However, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict put a significant strain on South Africa's relationship with Israel. In response to the protests along the Gaza border about 5 years back, South Africa withdrew its ambassador, effective immediately after what appeared to be a detent in 2017. The South African government's Department of International Relations and Cooperation issued a statement reiterating the country's view that the Israeli Defense Force must withdraw from the Gaza Strip and bring to an end the violent and destructive incursions into Palestinian territories. There had been tension in the diplomatic ties between the two nations ever since South Africa unilaterally downgraded them. The Miss South Africa pageant refused to boycott the Miss Universe event in Eilat, Israel, so the Department of Sports, Arts, and Culture in South Africa withdrew its support for the pageant a few years ago. Together with Algeria, South Africa led an abortive effort to revoke Israel's status as an observer at the African Union. Additionally, the government of South Africa persisted in publicly denouncing the actions of Israel in the conflict between Israel and Palestine and expressing solidarity with the latter, repeatedly restating its support for a peaceful two-state solution. A shared solidarity. South Africa has historically supported the Palestinian cause, much like many other nations that took the brunt of colonialism and occupation, like India. Not long after the overthrow of its own apartheid government in 1990, it established diplomatic ties with Palestine. There were several factors that led to South Africa's support for Palestine. First and foremost, it was sensitive to what was happening to Palestinians under Israeli occupation because of its own experience with discrimination and disempowerment. Nelson Mandela was a vocal advocate for Palestinian rights, much like Mahatma Gandhi. Furthermore, South Africa had not forgotten the West's role in maintaining apartheid, and Israel was widely perceived as a state supported by Western assistance. It had good reason to take stances in line with Russia, which had given military instruction to people opposing the apartheid government. South Africa's position was much the same as that of many other African nations for a long time following the establishment of Israel. Changing relations. But many African countries, including South Africa, loosened their stance on Israel over time. Africans saw few reasons to keep up their opposition as more Arab nations acknowledged the Jewish state. What the wealthy and technologically sophisticated Israel had to offer, new technologies in agriculture, aid funding, and military training, among other areas, was another important consideration. Trade between Israel and sub-Saharan African nations reached over $750 million in 2021, according to Al Jazeera. Israel supplies the continent with chemicals, electronics, and machinery. Nearly two-thirds of that were traded with South Africa, and Israel traded goods worth $129 million with Nigeria in 2021. With the exception of Algeria, which has a majority of Muslims, not many African nations have joined South Africa in denouncing Israel in its entirety. In fact, Kenya, Zambia, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo have supported Israel, according to Al Jazeera. Conflict fueling deep divisions. Jewish organizations and opposition politicians in South Africa have since been sharply divided over the country's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Democratic Alliance, DA, the principal opposition party, has equally maintained ever since a strained face at the government for backing Palestine and pulling out its diplomats, claiming this leaves South Africans in Israel defenseless and devoid of consular assistance. The government's decision to remove its diplomats from Tel Aviv was also opposed by the African Christian Democratic Party and the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP. Mkhuleko Lengwa, an IFP lawmaker, claimed in Parliament that recalling the ambassador was an error and akin to regressive diplomacy. According to Katz, the Patriotic Alliance, PA, and other parties support Israel for religious reasons, but the Democratic Alliance, DA, has a large number of supporters who are of Jewish descent. Leader of the PA, Gayton McKenzie, stated 2 weeks ago that his party is prepared to give up forming a coalition government with the ANC in Johannesburg after being urged to shift its position from Israel to Palestine. South Africa's unwavering stance. The ANC's close ties to anti-discrimination activism was one reason South Africa continued to support Palestine. In actuality, ANC leaders and other anti-apartheid activists have long drawn comparisons between Israel's treatment of Palestinians and that of black South Africans under the white government. During his 2002 speech in the United States, well-known anti-apartheid activist Bishop Desmond Tutu expressed his deep distress over his visit to the Holy Land, saying it reminded me so much of what happened to us black people in South Africa. I have witnessed Palestinians being humiliated at roadblocks and checkpoints, suffering in the same way that we do when young, white police officers stop us from moving around. Another factor had been to oppose a worldview that was shaped by the position of the West on significant issues. This was made abundantly evident when South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation Naledi Pandor questioned why the Western powers would not denounce Israel, and when African countries were being pressured to unite against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. Hours before Ramaphosa made remarks, Pandor had declared, "We have heard a tirade of criticism of Palestine from Western powers and unflinching support for the occupying power, despite the fact that the root cause of this conflict is illegal occupation. A global system that is biased in favor of the powerful and against those battling for their rights and self-determination gives rise to these kinds of double standards." South Africa and Israel have little political and diplomatic contact at the moment, primarily because of Israel's hostility towards the Middle East Peace Process, MEPP, and its contempt for international law with regard to the rights of the Palestinian people and their territories. The starting point for South Africa is that Israel needs to resume talks and establish conducive circumstances for amicable discussions. Conclusion: only a few African nations have diplomatic ties to both Israel and Palestine, including South Africa. Since the onset of the Israeli-Palestine conflicts, South Africa has been a steadfast supporter of Palestinian independence and the two-state solution, most probably because of the shared solidarity between the two formerly marginalized states. It is clear that the conflict, which began decades ago, has received mixed reviews from the world powers, but South Africa had always considered itself, as it still does, a defendant of Palestine. That brings us to the end of this video. We'd like to know your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, do not forget to leave a like and turn on pot notifications.